In September 1939, German panzers rolled into Poland, and the world was plunged into the deadliest war in human history. But a fire that big doesn't just start with a single spark. It was more like a 20-year-long fuse, a chain reaction that started the very second the last Great War ended. So today, we're going to trace that chain, link by link, and see just how the world went from one global conflict to an even bigger one. And that's really the big question, isn't it? How does that even happen? The generation that saw the horrors of World War I was so determined to never let it happen again. They called it the war to end all wars. So where did everything go so catastrophically wrong? Well, our story really begins right at the end of World War I. The peace treaty that was supposed to mend the world, well, it turned out to be incredibly flawed. In fact, you could say it planted the seeds for the next war before the ink on the paper was even dry. Let's talk about the Treaty of Versailles. It wasn't so much a peace deal as it was a long list of punishments aimed squarely at Germany. Germany had to accept all the blame for the war, pay a crippling amount of money in reparations, money it simply didn't have, and basically gut its entire military. This total humiliation created this dangerous and completely false idea in Germany that their army was never actually defeated, but was betrayed by politicians back home. They called it the stab-in-the-back myth. And on top of all that, the treaty literally redrew the map of Europe. New countries, like Czechoslovakia and Poland, were carved out. But this meant millions of ethnic Germans were suddenly living as minorities in these new nations. And this, right here, this was a ticking time bomb. It was the perfect excuse for a future German leader to say he was just reuniting his people. Now, a bad peace treaty is one thing, but that might have actually held together if the next domino hadn't fallen. And that domino was the entire global economy. The Great Depression created a perfect storm of misery and desperation, and it pushed people everywhere toward radical, extreme solutions and the promises of strongmen who said they had all the answers. And just look at these numbers. They tell a terrifying story. After the Wall Street crash in 1929, unemployment in Germany just exploded. By 1932, we're talking over 6 million people without a job, their savings wiped out, the democratic government seemed totally helpless, and the German people were getting desperate for anyone who offered a way out. And that person was, of course, Adolf Hitler. Back in the prosperous 20s, his Nazi party was just this tiny fringe group. But after the crash, his message of restoring Germany's pride and blaming others for their problems started to sound pretty good to a lot of people. By 1932, the Nazis were the biggest party in the German parliament. He was made chancellor in 1933, and then, in a brilliant and terrifying bit of political maneuvering, he used a fire at the parliament building to grab emergency powers, ban every other political party, and by 1934, he was the absolute dictator of Germany. Okay, so you've got a bitter, resentful Germany led by a ruthless, aggressive dictator. So where was the rest of the world? What were they doing? Well, the international system that was created to stop exactly this sort of thing was about to be put to the test, and it was going to fail spectacularly. The world's big hope for peace was this new organization, the League of Nations. The idea was simple. Countries would talk out their problems instead of fighting. But it had a massive, fatal flaw right from the very start. The country that came up with the idea, the United States, refused to join. They chose to be isolationist instead, and that left the League without a really powerful, neutral country to enforce its decisions. And it didn't take long for other aggressive nations to start testing the waters. In 1931, Japan just went in and seized Manchuria from China. In 1935, Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia. And then you have Germany and Italy using the Spanish Civil War as a kind of training ground for their new armies and weapons. A very clear, very dangerous pattern was emerging. So when the League of Nations formally condemned Japan's invasion, Japan's response was, well, pretty blunt. They basically said, "We don't accept your report," and they just walked out of the League. Which raised a really important question. What was the League going to do about it? The answer to that question was absolutely nothing. The League didn't have an army, it had no real power to back up its words, and at the same time, the big democracies, Britain and France, were basically paralyzed. They were still deeply traumatized by World War I, they were broke because of the Depression, and their militaries were in no condition to fight another huge war. All this weakness led to a new and ultimately disastrous policy. It was called appeasement. The thinking behind it came from a very understandable place, a desperate desire to avoid another world war. The idea was, okay, maybe if we just give Hitler what he says are his reasonable demands, he'll be satisfied and we can avoid a catastrophe. But of course, Hitler's demands just kept on growing. In 36, he sent his troops into the Rhineland, which was a direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. The world did nothing. In 38, he annexed his home country of Austria. Again, nothing. And then he turned his eyes to the Sudetenland, which was a part of Czechoslovakia with a large German population. So, desperate to stop a war, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, flew to Munich to meet with Hitler. And there, Britain and France made a deal. They agreed to give the Sudetenland to Germany. Chamberlain flew home to a cheering crowd, waving a piece of paper and famously declaring he had achieved peace in our time. But at what cost? You see, the whole idea of appeasement rested on one thing, that you could trust Hitler's word, and you couldn't. Just 6 months after he promised he wanted no more territory, his armies marched in and took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. Appeasement hadn't bought peace. It had just bought Hitler more time and made him bolder. By 1939, nobody could deny it anymore. Hitler's ambition was much bigger than just uniting German speakers. His next target was clear: Poland. And this time, to make sure he'd succeed, he made a move that shocked the entire world. What happened next was one of the most cynical and stunning deals in modern history. Nazism and communism, they were supposed to be absolute mortal enemies. But in August of 1939, Hitler and the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin signed a non-aggression pact. And in a secret part of that deal, they agreed to carve up Poland between them. For Hitler, this was huge. It meant he wouldn't have to fight a war on two fronts. It was a green light. With the Soviet Union on his side, the very last domino fell. On September 1st, 1939, German forces unleashed their new tactic of blitzkrieg, lightning war, on Poland. And this time, Britain and France, who had promised to protect Poland, had no choice left. They had to act. So Germany attacked from the west. A little over 2 weeks later, just as they'd planned, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. On September 3rd, Britain and France officially declared war on Germany. The fragile 20-year peace was over. The Second World War had begun. So when you look back at that whole cascade of events, the bad treaty, the economic crash, the world looking the other way, the failure of appeasement, you can't help but ask a haunting question. Was there one moment, one single point where the world could have acted differently and stopped that last domino from falling? It's something that's worth thinking about.